the Fukushima accident killed nobody. That's the first point to make, and didn't seriously irradiate anybody who's going to have health consequences as a result, which is rather remarkable for a major industrial accident. However, there are a lot of people who are displaced, who were evacuated, and it showed yet again, that with a nuclear accident, it doesn't blow up like a bomb, it evolves over days. So there's plenty of time for people to evacuate, and they did, but there's enormous disruption from that. And so in that sense, there is an economic risk from that, but the point is it's entirely avoidable. Those were old reactors, and they should not have failed in the way they failed. But you've got to say that a magnitude 9 earthquake and a 15-metre tsunami is a fairly unprecedented event. I mean, that is a major natural disaster which killed 19,000 people. The natural disaster did, the nuclear accident killed nobody. So it's a question of getting it into perspective, and the nuclear accident, the economic cost of the nuclear accident is relatively small compared with the economic cost of the tsunami and the earthquake. That's really all you can say, but it should have been zero. Eight reactors were closed, at the stroke of a pen, older ones, and there's another 9, I think, operating, and they will progressively close down as they come to their 40th anniversary of operation. I don't see a lot of prospect of that decision being reversed. It may be, once they start counting the cost of it. I mean, they're having enough trouble getting along at the moment, and as they progressively close those down, the situation will get a lot worse. And it doesn't matter how many wind turbines you build and how many hectares of solar panel you install, you have an unviable situation. And this is why they're talking about building new coal-fired plants and so forth. And those will be highly polluting in terms of CO2. So they've really sort of thrown that particular objective of their energy policy out the window. I was at a conference, a power generation conference, not a nuclear conference, but a broadly power gen one in Cologne in Germany 2 weeks ago. And this, of course, was a major topic of discussion. And the general consensus is that it's, it is a great way to destroy, of economic destruction, really. To take a lot of perfectly serviceable power plants offline, which the national regulator has confirmed are entirely safe by any criteria post-Fukushima, simply on an ideological basis. And it's put the country into a very, very precarious situation. It's staggering along okay, but the reserve margins are, almost non-existent. In the year and a bit since the decision to close down those nuclear plants, there have been hundreds, I understand, of sort of close calls in respect to grid stability and so forth, where there's normally only 2 or 3 per year, and the whole thing could come crashing down any time. So that's a possibility. Hopefully they will avert that. But the main issue is more of a long-term one, and that is that if they are paying through the nose for solar-generated power and wind-generated power, with an inadequate grid system to get it from where it's generated to where it's used, at the same time as that, it means that the coal plants, most obviously, but also the remaining nuclear plants, are run in a very uneconomic manner, and that can't continue. So how's it affected international relations? Well, I mean, other countries are rubbing their hands in glee around about because they'll be exporting a lot of electricity to Germany. The Czech Republic is looking at building, part of the rationale of their building new nuclear power plants is to export to Germany. The very explicit rationale for Russia building a 2,400 megawatt nuclear power plant in Kaliningrad is to export at least half of that power to Germany. and in fact they're synchronizing that reactor with the West German grid, not with the Russian grid, and so on. So in that sense, there's a lot of pleasure. Mr. Putin is delighted because he's exporting a lot more gas to Germany. So the decision has done a lot to cement German relationships with Russia and made Germany very explicitly dependent on Russia economically. Reprocessing works by chopping up the used fuel, generally 5 or 10 years after it's been taken out of the reactor, chopping it up, dissolving it in nitric acid, and then separating out the constituents. Now, reprocessing today, generally speaking, the move is to not separate plutonium as such and uranium separately, but to have some mix of the two. This is out of non-proliferation concerns. I mean, the reason it hasn't taken off is because uranium prices have been very low, and it's been uneconomic. But there are two economic benefits from reprocessing, despite the high cost of it. The one economic benefit is what you recycle. The other economic benefit is that your final deep geological repository for high-level waste only needs to be about 1/5 as big. That's after you've taken your 3% of high-level wastes out of the used fuel and incorporated that in borosilicate glass. That's where you get the extra volume. So 3% becomes 20% in effect in terms of volume. Natural uranium in the Earth's surface at this point in time, as distinct from 2 billion years ago when the first natural nuclear reactors ran in Africa, is about 0.7% U-235, which is a fissile isotope, which means it's easily used, and it's 99.3% uranium-238. Now, what happens is then that you need to design a reactor to use it at its natural ratios, and the UK did that after the war and designed a whole fleet of reactors that operated with natural uranium. The last one of those is still operating. Or you enrich the uranium so that the fissile isotope is 3 to 5%. And in that case, you can operate a reactor just using water as the coolant and the moderator. And that's what is done in most of the world's reactors outside of Canada, or outside of the particular Canadian design. Certainly all US reactors and all European reactors, apart from 1 or 2 Canadian ones, are what we call light water reactors, that is PWRs or BWRs. So that means that you actually burn, and so you put 5% uranium into the reactor, and you get about 1% uranium out of it when you remove the used fuel. But meanwhile, you put a whole lot of depleted uranium on the side, on the way through the front end of the fuel cycle. So what you're actually doing is only using about 0.6% of your original fuel. If you use a fast reactor, then U-238 becomes plutonium much more readily than in an ordinary reactor. In fact, about 1/3 of the energy from an ordinary reactor is from plutonium, which is generated from U-238. But that's almost incidental to the design. But in a fast reactor, you're actually maximizing the U-238 conversion to Plu-239 and burning that. So you can get 50, 60 times as much energy out of your uranium as with an ordinary reactor. Renaissance is perhaps a too strong a term, but certainly there is a lot going on. There are about 65 nuclear reactors under construction at the moment. There are another 150 that are planned, that is to say, that are likely to come online in 8 to 10 years. That's fairly strong progress, and most of those are big reactors, and they're newer and better than the old ones. Well, the drivers of investment in nuclear power at the moment are firstly the basic economics. That is the cost per kilowatt hour of power that you're going to get out of the new plant, and the fact that you're likely to get that for 60 years. Secondly, the second driver is energy security. A good deal of the US energy budget goes into, defence budget goes into energy-related matters, securing supplies of oil and gas, for instance. And energy security is a very big issue in Europe, as you've no doubt discovered. In the UK, it has to import a lot of its energy. Western Europe has to import a lot of its energy. And that gives a profound feeling of unease, because with coal and gas you cannot store vast amounts of it. With uranium you can. You just need a warehouse down the road and you can store 2 or 3 years' supply with no problem at all. And also uranium comes from parts of the world which are generally seen to be of less political concern than where a lot of your oil and gas comes from. Also, there are enormous resources of uranium. There is no sort of obvious limit there in terms of the amount that is known, and any figures you've ever seen are only of known resources. And the more money you spend, the more you find, or the more you prove up, in particular, to a degree of certainty where you can start quoting figures. So there's heaps of uranium. And also, if you then move into generation 4 reactors, which are going to be mainly fast neutron reactors, you actually use that uranium about 50 or 60 times more effectively. So, there is no resource limitation in sight with regard to nuclear power based on uranium. The main challenge that nuclear power has is getting the finance for the new plants. Nuclear power plants are very expensive to build. The actual electricity they produce is still very, very competitive by any standard almost anywhere in the world because the running costs and the fuel costs are very low. But it's still a big challenge, putting a lot of money together to invest in a nuclear plant, 2, 3, 4 years before you get any return. And the other driver of nuclear power too that you asked about is really the clean energy aspect, insofar as global warming concerns are taken on board politically, and you've therefore got political policy drivers to limit CO2 emissions, then nuclear power is a prime way of doing that. Well, I think natural gas and coal will continue to be important. Eventually we'll get some sort of carbon capture and storage, but it will probably double the price of electricity from coal. The price of electricity from gas depends very much on the gas price, because about 70% of the cost of the electricity is the fuel. Whereas with nuclear, it's only about 7% of the cost of the electricity is fuel. So the uranium price can go up and down like a yo-yo, and it doesn't affect the electricity cost. But look, I'd see nuclear playing a very strong role in future, particularly if people are concerned about carbon constraints. And I think you can assume that everybody's always concerned to a large degree about the cost of electricity. Keeping electricity cheap is a social good in any country, and particularly in developing countries where a lot of people don't have electricity at all. I mean, there's still nearly 2 billion people on the face of the earth that don't have any access to electricity, and probably another 1.5 billion for whom that access is pretty rudimentary. So there's a lot of scope there. Nuclear power has a role to play, renewables have a role to play, fossil fuels have a role to play. I just think nuclear power is a very exciting technology from my point of view as a science background. It's an enormously important technology at this time in the world with a rapidly increasing energy demand and electricity demand, which is increasing much faster than primary energy demand. And it's a major way of meeting that demand without emissions, basically. Hore Lacy, Director of Information for the World Nuclear Association.